Professor Babu is a historian of Islam and modern West African Muslim diaspora, which is looking at the issue of migration within the Muslim community of West Africa who have migrated to other parts of the world, especially North America and Europe. Professor Babu is currently a professor at the History Department of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia since 2002. He studied at the University in Dakar in Senegal and also in Michigan at the Michigan State University in the US before he is now currently a professor at, as I said, at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Prof. Babu has published quite extensively on this topic, on the whole question of Islam and Sufism and Pacifism and all of the themes that are related to this other tradition of Islam. One of his seminal works is his publication on fighting the greater jihad, fighting the greater jihad. Amadou Bamba and the founder of the Mouridia of Senegal. Some of you who have done the history of Islam will definitely know of Amadou Bamba, and he is one of the towering figures of Islamic mysticism in West Africa. So that is one of his major publications. He's quite published other books and several other journal articles and book chapters and co-edited a number of volumes. And he is also done quite a number of academic presentations and several conferences around the world on the topic of Islam, Sufism, and also on migration, Muslim migration, and also even Senegalese politics and the African diaspora also. Sheikh Babu has also served as the editor of the Journal of African History, and he was the chief editor for this journal, a very, very highly regarded academic journal on the history, Journal of African History, and he was the editor of that journal from 2010 to 2015. Sheikh Babu will tell his own story, but he and Professor Lamine Sane know each other very quite well, and Lamine had spoken to me very fondly of Sheikh Babu and the works that he has done that he admires so much. So when we talk about this topic on beyond jihad, the pacifist tradition of Islam in West Africa, we thought nobody is eminently qualified than Sheikh Babu to address this topic. And so I will turn the mic over to Sheikh Babu, who will give an address of about 45 minutes. And then we will engage with questions and interaction for the remaining of the time. I will again encourage you to keep your mics muted when Sheikh Babu is going on with the presentation. If you have a question, please post it on the chat if you can. And if you can't, when we are done with the presentation, we will make time available for you to ask your question, raise up your hand and raise your question. So Sheikh Babu, thank you. Thank you for accepting this invitation and welcome. And I hand over the baton to you for you to give us the lecture on the pacifist tradition of Islam in West Africa. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Thank you so much, John, for the generous introduction. I would like to congratulate the Sane Institute for organizing this wonderful lecture series that offer a platform to explore questions of great importance for our time. For me, it's an honor and a pleasure to deliver the concluding lecture for the year 2021. Jihad has become a metonym for Islam, and Islamic Africa is no exception. The historiography of Islam in Africa is dominated by studies of Muslim militant movement. Through Islam, it was believed emerged in sub-Saharan Africa through jihads that removed syncretism and heterodoxy. Studies of jihad and Muslim state building were then seen as a way of inscribing African Islam into the broader history of the religion Islam, if not into global history. Just recently, one prominent historian of Africa observes, and I quote, if we examine the age of revolutions as a unifying feature of history in the world of Western Europe and the Americas, we need to understand the age of jihad in West Africa in the same period. End of quote. I contend that when we look at the history of Islam in Africa from a long durée perspective, it becomes clear that instances of jihad and militancy are the exception rather than the rule. Islam spread across sub-Saharan Africa through peaceful means carried by traders, clerics, and saints. So when we move from the high politics of Muslim warriors and state builders and focus on the work of Muslim entrepreneurs and organic intellectuals who run Quranic schools, build a network of disciples, maintain mosque, provide services to ordinary Muslim and client, we can discern a deep-rooted tradition of quietism, tolerance, and pacifism in African Islam. Jihad, as we know, has meant a different thing to different Muslim communities across space and time. Its meaning has never ceased changing right down to our own day. As historian Michael Bonner argued, I quote, if jihad ever had an original core, this has been experienced anew many times, unquote. The changing meaning of jihad has more to do with the condition of Muslim societies in specific context and time than with scriptural stipulations. It is possible to distinguish something that could be called classical jihad. The exercise of this form of jihad can be located in the period between 624 CE and 661 CE. This era in Islamic history coincided with the rule of Prophet Muhammad in Medina and that of the four rightly guided caliphs. During this period, jihad was a practice rather than a formal ideology. Nevertheless, ideas about jihad from this era could be distilled from the Quran, the biography and hagiography of the Prophet, the Hadith, and the so-called Maghazi or Book of Wars. From these texts, written sometimes 2 centuries after the events they narrate, it's possible to distinguish a few principles that later serve as the foundation of a classical doctrine of jihad that was formulated during the Abbasid Caliphate from the 8th century CE. But before getting to a discussion of these principles, I wanted to say a few words about the etymology of the word jihad and its presence in the Quran. The word jihad means struggle, striving, persevering. The basic connotation is an endeavor towards praiseworthy aims for the betterment of the community through one's wealth, one's voice, or jihad of the tongue, or one's intellectual, or jihad of the pen. Jihad also connotes the struggle to tame one's carnal soul. This is, of course, the greater jihad of the Sufi that I'll be talking about later on. The root of the word jihad, jahada, appears 41 times in the Quran and the different meaning that relate to generosity, gift, and almsgiving. There are 10 instances where it relates directly to war. From 610 CE, when the Prophet Muhammad received the first revelation in Mecca, to 622 CE, when he migrated to Medina, he only waged what one might call jihad of the tongue. The Quranic verse that for the first time authorized the use of violence to defend the nascent Muslim communities in Medina was revealed in 624 CE. And it reads, I quote, "Leave is given to those who are fought because they were wrong. Surely God is able to help them. who were expelled from their habitations without right, except they say, our Lord is God. Had God not driven back the people, some by means of others, there had been destroyed cloisters and churches, oratories, and mosques wherein God's name is much mentioned. From this verse and others related sources, we may conceive classical jihad as a defensive war. Fighting this jihad required following an ethic of war rooted in the Quran and Hadith that determine the leadership and nature of the fighting force, the enemy, rule of engagement and treatment of the spoil of war, and the condition for making peace. Legitimate jihad should be led by a caliph for the Sunni and an imam for the Shia at the head of army of volunteers motivated by their own salvation and the protection of the Muslim community. For example, the killing of the elders, of children, of priests, of monk, and of rabbi, or just for non-combatant was prohibited. As the Islamic dominion expanded outside of Arabia and clashed with Byzantium in the Persian Empire, and the leadership shifted to powerful dynasties, the nature of jihad changed. While some principles such as the protection of the people of the book and the goal of defending the land of Islam remained, jihad was increasingly put at the service of the imperial ambitions of rulers more interested in accumulating power and wealth. Classical jihad gradually gave way to fighting practices that were not different from those of the enemy that the Muslim confronted. The expanding Muslim empire created new conditions and challenges that required continuing revision and rethinking of the meaning of jihad. In many regions of the land of Islam, including North Africa, but especially South and Southeast Asia, Muslim rulers were a small minority ruling large population of non-Muslims. Competing Muslim dynasties fought each other, sometimes in the name of jihad. Governing an empire required a professional and salaried standing army and logistics that could not rely on the original notion of volunteerism, gift-giving, and generosity in the name of God. Jurists debated the legitimacy of jihad fought by legitimate or illegitimate rulers against Muslim and non-Muslims. They scrutinized the motivations, character, and piety of those who call for jihad to weigh the lawfulness of their action. These debates loom large in the history of Islam in Africa in the 19th century, when Abdul Qadir tried to mobilize reluctant Algerian Sufis against the French colonial invasion in the 1830s, and in West Africa when Usman Dan Fodio and El Haji Omar Tal waged jihad against the Muslim rulers they accused of corruption and hypocrisy. In our time, in the context of rising militancy and Islamist violence against Muslims and non-Muslims alike, in the name of jihad, debate about the legitimacy and opportunity of jihad of the sword continue to rage among Muslims. A recent Gallup poll asked Muslims worldwide to tell in one word what jihad means to them. Personal definition of jihad range from affirming commitment to work hard, achieving one's goal in life, assisting others, struggle to achieve a noble cause, etc. Small minorities in 4 Muslim countries in Iran, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Turkey reported sacrificing their life for the cause of Islam. Muslims who gave such response are likely to affirm the legitimacy and urgency of jihad against those that they call the new crusaders in the West and their ally in the Muslim world, who, according to them, are bent on destroying Islam and spreading Western values and culture. The best representative of this group are the Salafist jihadi. They claim that jihad is the sixth, or should be the sixth pillar of Islam, or what they call the missing obligation for Muslims, and that it is no longer a collective duty, what the Sharia call Fard al-Kifaya, fulfilled by volunteer fighters as at the time of the Prophet, but an individual duty of all Muslims, or what they call Fard al-Ain. Osama bin Laden's fatwa to declare war on the West is a good illustration of this way of thinking. Let me quote from that fatwa. I quote, "In compliance with God's order, we issue the following fatwa to all Muslims. The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque or Jerusalem and the Holy Mosque, he means Mecca here, from their grips, and in order for their armies to move out of the land of Islam. This is in accordance with the word of Almighty God, where he said, and fight the pagans all together as they fight you all together, and fight them until there is no more tumult or oppression, and there prevail justice and faith in God, end of quote. In contrast to bin Laden and like-minded promoters of jihad of this word, there are those that I call liberal Muslim who reject the lawfulness and legitimacy of jihad after the Prophet Muhammad. Liberal Muslims are mostly interested in exploring scriptural prescription and proscriptions to lay the foundation of a tradition of secularism, tolerance, and non-violence in Islam. Exploring the relationship between religion and the state, they argue that the Prophet Muhammad was a warner and not a warden, and that Islam supports the separation of church and state. This argument is endorsed by Islamic thinkers such as the 14th century Tunisian scholar Ibn Khaldun, who wrote, I quote, "Since the Quran emphasizes a just society rather than an ideological state, the form of the state takes not mandated. The form the state takes is not mandated. Muslims should regard the Quran as a moral edifice rather than a code of laws." End quote. Contemporary scholars such as Ira Lapidus and Lamin Sane are of the same opinion. Lapidus observed that from the 10th century, in the Arab Muslim Empire, and I quote him here, religion and political life developed distinct sphere of experience with independent values, leaders, and organizations. End of quote. Sane argued that the idea of revealed law in Islam is predicated on God as lawgiver and ruler of the universe. Human affairs belong in the realm of the created order, while religion has its foundation in the transcendent will of God, end quote. Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, the Sudanese thinker and activist who was accused of heresy and executed in 1983, offers, in my view, the most original interpretation of the separation of religion and state in Islam. Taha argued that the Quran contained a double message, one that is delivered to Muhammad, the Prophet in Mecca, and another that was destined for Muhammad, the earthly ruler in Medina. He suggests that the second message that aimed at government on earth ceased to be valid after the death of Muhammad. Only the first message directed to the pure prophet in Mecca has universal validity and should remain as guidance to the Muslim until the end of time. The underlying argument in this interpretation is a rejection of the validity of jihad of the sword in the post-prophetic era and a refutation of the idea that 7th century Medina is a model Islamic state for Muslims to emulate in all time at all places as believed by Islamists. By disentangling religion from the state, liberal Muslims are able to articulate an ethics and a practice of conversion that reject coercion and emphasize tolerance and gradualism. Here, evidence is found in the Quran, for example, and the Hadith. I can refer, for example, to this verse in the Quran, which say, there should be no compulsion in religion. Truth stands out clear from error. Whosoever rejects evil and believe in God has grasped the most trustworthy handhold that never breaks. Other favorite quote by liberal Muslims, for example, are this verse, say, I worship not that which you worship, nor will you worship that which I worship. And I shall not worship what you are worshiping. To you your religion, and to me my religion. Another verse read, if your Lord had willed it, all the people on the earth would have come to believe, one and all. Liberal Muslim emphasis on tolerance and patience and coercion, on conversion, echo their rejection of extremism. They evoke Quranic condemnation of what the Quran calls gulub, or excessiveness, or tanattu, that is going beyond the limit in utterance and action, and tashtij, which means strictness and austerity. And they emphasize Quranic call for moderation, such as in this verse, do not exceed the limit of your religion. And that hadith of the Prophet that says, I quote, beware of excessiveness in religion. People before you have perished as a result of such excessiveness, end quote. They remind people of the prophetic characterization of Islam as a religion of the middle ground, or din al-wasati. For liberal Muslims, jihad should be understood in the context of dawah, which is a call to natural reason through study, reflection, and contemplation. They argue that divine revelations are apprehended through investigation, demonstration, and free choice. There should be no power but reason, no coercion except through argument. Despite scholarly fascination with jihad, I am suggesting that the trajectory of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa is more reflective of the value of liberal Islam than militancy. I would like to turn now to the example that El-Hajj Salim Suwari, the founder of the Suwarian tradition of Islam, and the Sufi leader Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, founder of the Mouridia Sufi order in Senegal, to demonstrate the connection between liberal Muslim thinkers and the tradition of pacifism and nonviolence in sub-Saharan Africa. El-Hajj Salim Suwari spent the earlier part of his life in Massina, in the current Republic of Mali. This is a region located in the heart of the Sudanic empires of Mali and Songhai, exposed to the influence of Timbuktu, Jenne, and other centers for the production and diffusion of Islamic knowledge in medieval Africa. None of El-Hajj Suwari's writings seem to have survived, but information gleaned from local hagiographical texts in Arabic and local languages can help us sketch his biography. There is no scholarly consensus about the time when he lived, but the early 16th century suggested by historian Ivor Wilkes seem more plausible. El-Hajj Salim is described as a highly learned and pious Muslim. He has performed the pilgrimage to Mecca in numerous times. Sources refer to him as an imam and wali, meaning a friend of God, and leader of the Jahanke or Jula community. El-Hajj Salim teaching were instrumental in the construction of the identity of diaspora of Jula traders and scholars that span West Africa, including land governed by non-Muslim, such as, for example, Ashanti. Building on the work of Ivor Wilkes and Lamine Sane, who offer the most complete scholarly reconstruction of the life and influence of El-Hajj Salim Suwari, it is possible to outline the most salient dimension of his thoughts and teachings. El-Hajj Salim teachings represent the foundation of a pedagogical tradition among the Jula that has resisted the test of time. They continue to shape behavior down to our time. These teachings concern primarily the issues of conversion, religion and the state, the relationships between Muslim and non-Muslims, and jihad. These same questions, as we have seen, are at the center of the preoccupation of liberal Muslims. El-Hajj Salim taught that unbelief was the result of ignorance rather than wickedness. Echoing Al-Kanimi, who later in the 19th century used the same argument against the Sokoto jihadists, El-Hajj Salim argued that it's God's will that some people will remain in the state of ignorance longer than others. True conversion, in his view, will occur only when God wills it. Therefore, coercing people to convert is tantamount to refusing to accept God's design for the world. El-Hajj Salim condemned jihad of the sword against unbelievers as an unacceptable method of conversion. For him, recourse to arms is permissible only in self-defense when the very existence of the Muslim community is threatened by others. Regarding the relationship between religion and the state, El-Hajj Salim taught that Muslims may accept the authority of non-Muslim rulers and even support it, so long as this enables them to live their life in accordance with their religion. For him, non-Muslim government is preferable to non-government at all. Ahmadou Bamba, the founder of the Mouridia in late 19th Senegal, used a similar argument in a fatwa he wrote in 1910 to condemn the jihad waged by the Mauritanian cleric Mal al-Ainin against the French in Morocco. El-Hajj Salim inspired a pedagogy of conversion based on patience and exemplary behavior. This pedagogy required of Muslims, wherever they live, to embody the highest values and ideal so that they represent attractive examples for people to emulate when, according to God's will, the time for conversion arrives. Finally, El-Hajj Salim emphasized the central role of education to ensure that Muslims kept the observance of their law free from error. El-Hajj Salim Suarez's teaching were preserved and disseminated through networks of scholars and teachers linked by isnad or chain of authority. These scholars carried the legacy of Suari Islamic tradition through half a millennium. I will note the resilience of Suari teaching, even when its disseminators were persecuted by jihadists who condemned them because of their opposition to warfare and their willingness to accommodate non-Muslim rulers, including European colonialists. I believe that it's possible to discern an epistemological kinship between liberal Islam, the Suari Islamic tradition, and the thought and practice of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, the founder of the Mouridiyya in Senegal. Jonathan Bormann provides evidence of direct link between Jahanke clerics, bearers of El-Hajj Salim Suarez's teaching, and Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, and he describes the different ways in which Bamba's teaching and practices align with Suari tradition. Bamba was a Sufi, but I am arguing that although most liberal Muslims do not refer to Sufi Islam, and Al-Hajj Salim himself lived at a time when institutional Sufism had very little influence in sub-Saharan Africa, these three Muslim traditions share a similar ethic and theology. Sufi theology offers the most compelling articulation of a pacifist and non-violence tradition in Islam. In the time I have remaining, I would like to offer a brief discussion of what I see as building block of a Sufi ethic of religious pluralism and non-violence, and how this ethic informed the teaching and practices of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. I am focusing here particularly on the concept of batin and ma'rifa, and on Sufi conception of the relationships between the cleric and the state. Perhaps one of the most salient features of Sufism is the distinction between the worlds of batin, that is the hidden, the internal, and that of zahir, that is the manifest or external. The Sufis' emphasis on batin has important theological and organizational implications. Perhaps the most consequential of these implications is the suggestion that God can be known through other means rather than the divine revelation enshrined in the Quran. Because the word of batin does not avail itself to discursive scrutiny, Sufi theology tends to favor universalist perception of religion that puts an emphasis on sameness rather than the difference that an exoteric and legalistic reading of Islam would encourage. This is what Ingenieur explained when he writes, and I quote, "When God is comprehended intellectually, theological differences arise. But when he is approached devotionally, everything dissolves into his beings and differences are wiped out," end quote. Devotional approach to God, of course, does not eliminate difference. Indeed, Sufi rituals can be, and of course, often are, source of division. But the kind of division that this devotional approach creates tends to be less contentious because they are legitimized through esoteric and therefore untestable knowledge. I am arguing that the world of batin represents a universal spiritual canvas that provides space for the expression of diverse religious traditions. In their quest for closeness to God, one of the greatest rewards that Sufi long for is the acquisition of marifa or gnosis. Marifa is knowledge beyond the book that God gives to whom he wishes, but particularly to those who have succeeded in befriending him, the wali, Allah. Marifa is experiential knowledge that is acquired through ilham, inspiration, or kashf, unveiling. Marifa is therefore unmediated knowledge that escapes the strictures of nature and the human intellect. It is in fact always received in a state of altered consciousness. For Sufis, the immediacy of this knowledge gives Marif a certain superiority over other forms of religious knowledge mediated by the sense or by reason. Ilham and Kashf are the tools through which the Sufi unveil the hidden meaning of Quran and in so doing avail religious theological openness. So Marifa allows Sufi to reach beyond scripture-bound knowledge, denoting the view that basic truths can be expressed in several religions. This pluralistic theology positioning explains why Sufi tend to stress the connection between Islam and other religions. This logic has brought some Sufis, such as Jalaluddin Rumi and the medieval Andalusian Sufi Ibn Sabin, to mitigate the claim of Islamic monopoly over the religious truth of the knowledge of God and to consider the possibility that divine truths can also be found in other religions. Sufi theological innovation are only possible because of the unmooring of Islam from rigid legalistic structures and the Sufis' emphasis on God's immanence and the possibility of personal and individual relationship with him. Sufi are able to make the theological synthesis and cultural compromises that explain their spiritual agility because they have always arrived to keep their autonomy from the state. Ghazali's well-known statement that the best ulama are those who do not know and are not known by the Sultan offer the best illustration of the Sufi suspicion of state power. Ghazali enjoined ulama to avoid violence and combat unjust rulers through the tongue and the pen, and if these weapons should trigger violence and chaos, to hold the contents against them in your heart. But most Sufi favor escapism, choosing sometimes a peripatetic lifestyle, taking their message to remove places away from the center of power or to land where the influence of the state was weak. In doing so, they have enjoyed the freedom to model their religion in conformity with their idiosyncratic inspiration, defying the conformism of ulama and their state sponsors. Amadou Bamba was one of those charismatic Sufi who founded his own community in Senegal in the late 19th century. Like Sufi who preceded him, Bamba drew inspiration from Sufi theology and philosophy to model his own community. Two key concepts, among others, provided the philosophical underpinning of pluralism in the Muridiyya. These concepts are maslaha and ecumenism. The word maslaha refers to the common good. The aim of maslaha are fivefold: the preservation of religion, the preservation of life, the preservation of reason, and the preservation of one's descendant and property. We can understand then any action that is taken which does not contradict the principle of Islam, but which protect the public good is maslaha, and therefore should be encouraged. I've already indicated that Sufi scholars have been historically critical of unjust rulers and have warned against the corrupting potential of power. But they have also been careful to avoid creating situations of chaos and violence where the life and property of Muslims may be put in jeopardy. Some of these scholars even agreed that tyranny is better than anarchy and civil strife. In line with this thinking, Shah Ahmadou Bamba distresses the role of rulers of pre-colonial Senegal and the French colonial rulers. But he also criticized the Muslims who waged jihad of the sword against them. He blamed those who choose the way of violence to bring social change for being motivated by greed and power and achieving nothing but hurting the Muslim community they pretended to protect. Ecumenism constitutes another founding principle of pluralism in Bamba's thought and practices. Shah Ahmadou Bamba's ecumenism reflects Sufi universalism that I discussed above. It is rooted in Iman, or faith, and in the Sufi idea of unity of the creation, which implies that all human beings originated from one soul. And God has endowed humanity with reason so that man can distinguish between good and evil, and he has made it their duty everywhere to recommend what is good and to discourage what is forbidden. Because the human is in God's eye the single being to deserve to be entrusted with reason and intelligence, he is Khalifatullah fil ard, or a representative of God on earth. So whether one is a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, or a pagan, they belong all to the same family, the human family, and they are all Khalifatullah fil ard. The ecumenism of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba is reflected both in his interaction with people of other faiths as well as his relationship with his fellow Muslims. It was logical that Bamba's absolute trust in God should also translate into openness of mind and religious tolerance. He repudiated the wholesale condemnation of people because of their belief and used forgiveness as a therapy against violence. After returning to Senegal after 7 years of exile by the French, he proclaimed that he had forgiven all of his enemies. Let me conclude with a few words here. When we think of Islam as an African religion, and not a religion of Arabs or of converts, and of African Muslims not as mere imitators, but as intellectual innovators, it will be possible to unearth what scholar Usman Khan called the African Islamic Library. I am suggesting that the most important contribution this library makes to the history of Islam, particularly in our time, when Islamic violence is spreading across Africa, is an Islamic ethic rooted in pluralism, tolerance, and nonviolence. Although the battle is not only about ideas, it is important for scholars and policymakers alike to pay serious attention to local quietist African Islamic tradition that, in my view, constitute the most effective tools for combating radical Islamism. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Prof. Babu. Thank you so much. There was a lot in that lecture. I think this lecture has been very informative and educational for some of us. And I like the whole idea of discovering the African Islamic Library. So thank you. And also for linking Sowerian tradition with Sufism and with Ahmadu Bamba and the Muridiya. That is fascinating. The other dimension that for me is so powerful is also how current day liberal Muslims are using themes and ideas that exist and existed in the Sowerian tradition and in Sufism without even calling themselves Sufis and not subscribing to Sufism. That is very fascinating. Thank you. I will kick off with a question that I have been asked over and over again when I talk about the pacifist tradition. How do you explain the fact that some of the jihadis who fought and conducted jihad in the 19th century, in particular, the Danfodios, Umar Tals, and others, were themselves followers of Sufi orders? How do you explain that from your lecture?
It's an interesting question. Even before you have Danfodio, you have Abdel Kader in Algeria.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think when we look at Sufism, the arc of their philosophy and morality bend toward peace and tolerance. But they see what they consider sometimes as extraordinary circumstances that represent a threat to Islam and Islamic identity itself. And when they see that, then it overrides their own philosophy of thinking and thinking. But what is important to John here is that when you look at Usman Danfodio particularly, and you look at Umar Tal, they go to great lengths actually to justify why they are fighting jihad.
Yes.
That certainly give an idea of their own struggle with their own principle, because they know they are violating their principles. Yeah. And they always need to convince themselves and to convince Muslim that they are doing nothing wrong. Usman Danfodio wrote extensively about why am I fighting, particularly because he was fighting Muslims too. He was fighting fellow Muslims. El Hajj Omar Tal wrote a whole treaty to justify his own jihad against Masina, which was also a Muslim state. So they all have this kind of dilemma as to what do we do when Islam itself is under threat. And they always bring the idea of the Prophet Muhammad fighting for self-defense. And really having to confront a greater threat that, in fact, if nothing is done, might wipe out Islam itself. And when that happened, then they think it's acceptable to forfeit their own philosophy and their own thinking in order to defend Islam.
Thank you. That is again very, very fascinating, because I have never thought about the apologies of the jihadists as even something to be considered, because they really were at pains to explain themselves, so to speak, and to explain their actions.
Absolutely, especially the Sufis. And you have Abdullah Danfodio, who is the brother of Usman Danfodio. I mean, who is really self-deprecating himself and complaining about the fact that jihad has corrupt people here. And even saying that I'm going to Mecca. I'm leaving the caliphate itself because what is happening is completely against our own principles. So, I mean, the Sufi, at least the Sufi, now it's different when you move to the Sufi and get to the Sufi jihadi and others that have a very different conception of jihad.
Thank you. Now, there's a question on the platform. It says, would you explain what you mean by saying jihad is a practice rather than an ideology? When does jihad becomes a practice, and when should it be considered an ideology?
I think jihad, when it was done, when it's from 624, when the Prophet Muhammad received a revelation allowing him to fight and defend the people of Medina, I mean, it was just an act for survival. So how do we survive? The nascent community, around 1,500 Muslim in Medina at that time, in a population of 10,000, and of course you add the thousands in Mecca. For him, jihad was just an act for survival. It's really a bricolage if you look at a modern concept. How do we survive? So people are not thinking about what they were doing. And the rules were made while they were fighting. You have to wait until the 8th century, really, under the Abbasid regime, when Muslim jurists started to think about jihad and start to formulate an ideology in order to legitimize it and to put together rules and what you might call a method for fighting jihad. So that's what I mean when I say it was a practice before becoming a doctrine and an ideology.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope the one who asked the question has gotten the explanation. Thank you very much. So the other issue is where then, somebody's asking the question, where then does extremism come from in Islam? Where do they draw from? From where do they draw what he calls extremism? If what you have explained is what actually constitutes the core of Islamic teaching, as Mahmoud Taha will argue, where is the extremism coming from?
Well, you know, extremism is coming from wherever extremists come from, any religion. You know, we are students of religion. You read the Bible, you read the Torah. I mean, the ancient and the Old and the New Testament. You read the Quran. You certainly see passages that, to some extent, accept, sometimes encourage the use of violence, mostly for defensive purposes. And you see many more statements about peace, about forgiveness, about generosity, about good moral, and so forth. So when you look at our sacred scriptures, they reflect life at the time when they were written. You look at the Quran, it's a 7th century text. It reflects the practice and values of the 7th century. in its complexity, in its diversity. Now, what happened with extremists everywhere is that when they look at sacred texts, they select dimensions that support their own ideology. You look at the Quran, there are a few verses. I said, there are 41 instances where jihad is mentioned in the Quran. Only 10 refer to violence. Among those 10, there are 2 or 3 that specifically are called by some people jihad sword verses. These are verses that tolerate fighting others and killing and so forth. When you are an extremist in the 21st century, and then you're looking for an ideology to legitimize and justify your own extremist leanings, it is very easy to select those verses and to use it as a foundation for fighting, for using violence to fight Muslims and non-Muslim alike. This is why I quoted from Bin Laden. I quoted from Bin Laden, and Bin Laden is quoting the Quran actually. The latest version is in the Quran. But you can quote 1,000 more verses that say the contrary of what he says. And unfortunately, we live in a world where what is happening is what I think Felix Jenkins called holy amnesia. Holy amnesia. People are polemical. They are always looking in somebody else's scriptures, statement that are taken out of context and then used to demonize people in the 21st century, while knowing that those people represent a tiny, tiny, tiny minority in the broader tradition of that creed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Again, fascinating. There's this question that one of the participants is asking. So from what you've just expounded to us this afternoon, this morning, wherever you may be, depending on where you are you suggesting therefore that the jihadists of the past and even today misunderstand Islamic teaching, don't know Islam that well? That's the question basically. Have they misunderstood Islam?
Well, I think that first of all, jihad changed over time. And my whole point was trying to explain from a historical perspective, to try to contextualize what jihad meant over time. Certainly what he meant at the time of the Prophet is very different from what he meant at the time of the Muslim Empire, where you basically have secular rulers that are not interested in religion, but are Muslim, ruling and using Islam as a mean of justifying whatever it is they do, and power and authority and money, and just like not different from the Persian king and the Persian Sultan and the Roman Emperor. So you see that its meaning changed. You look at the era of colonialism, it completely changed. People used jihad as a mean of mobilizing people to fight when French colonized European colonizers. In the 21st century, you see people using jihad as a mean of fighting what they call Western cultural imperialism, or whatever it is that they are fighting against. Many among those people do not ignore Islam at all. But one thing we need to understand is this. There is sacred scripture, which for believers is sacred. And there is human-produced religious knowledge, which, of course, is not sacred. When we look at human-produced religious knowledge, which is subject to time and circumstances, and which is subject to discursive criticism, then we clearly see that at specific time and in specific places, people draw from sacred scripture to produce and to construct religious knowledge that respond to their own preoccupation of their time. I think that is the same thing that happened also in other religious traditions. You go to Torah, you read the Torah, you clearly see difference between the way people interpret the Torah before Israel and the way they interpret it like today. If you see Christian tradition, you have many traditions, evangelism and others, and all of them draw from the same well, but then they put it in different recipient and they use it differently. It's not different from Islam in my view.
Thank you once again. And absolutely, and people are singing from the same hymn sheet, but they are singing different tunes. And it's always been, it's all about interpretation, interpretation, interpretation. Thank you.
And what is important, Jonathan, John, I think what is important here, I think people need to clearly understand what Muslims believe is divine, unchanging, timeless revelation, and what is human-produced religious knowledge.
Yeah.
That, of course, is not sacred, but doesn't represent Muslims, but only represent those who made those interpretations.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of our friends is asking also here, so if Islam resists jihadism irrespective of tradition and only endorses proportionate response when faced with attacks, do you think this insight has been amplified enough in both scholarly and policy debates in the context of ongoing terrorism in West Africa? And what can be done to ensure pacifism receives greater attention in the region to counter terrorism programs, as you concluded with on your lecture, the note on which you concluded? And this is what the question is asking. What can we do to amplify these kinds of voices and to bring to the fore this tradition of Islam, which, as you have said in your opening remarks, have been somewhat underrepresented and marginalized even in scholarly sources? What can be done to bring it back into the universities, into the schools, into the public discourse, to counter this jihadist militant narrative that is out there now?
Thank you for that important question. I think one thing we need to do is first to accept the idea that there is diversity within Islam. That's where we should start.
Yeah.
That Islam is not a monolith.
Yeah.
That jihad is not a metonym for Islam. That's where I started.
Yeah.
That jihad is not a metonym of Islam. That Islam is not a monolith. Yeah. That when we look at Islam from an African perspective, a jihad from an African perspective is a changing concept that can only be understood within a context. That we cannot take it out of context and they'd use it as a club to beat Muslim everywhere. I think we need to start there. Now, and the second thing is, once we accept that idea of diversity within Islam, then we need to listen and to take seriously those diverse voices that exist within Islam. What is unfortunate in our time is those who got the megaphone are those who threaten people.
Yeah.
And it's a Western tradition. They only care about people who threaten them.
Yeah.
And people understand it. People are looking for the nuclear weapon because the only way to be respected by the West is exactly to be a threat.
Yeah.
You see, I used to tell my friend jokingly here at Penn that, well, you know, the Islam I teach is not very popular because it's not threatening. You know, and John, one of my students actually who liked my class actually very well, after the end of one of my lectures, two of my students, three actually of them told me, Prof, if you just put jihad in the title, you will have so many students in this class. It's so great. I'm telling you, John, it's so great. Just put jihad on the title. You know, you will have, have plenty of students coming in. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to move beyond that mentality. Yeah. We need to listen. Yeah. We need to accept the idea of diversity within Islam. Yeah. We need to learn to listen to these diverse voices within Islam. Yeah. And we need to take seriously that African Islamic library I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is so true. The diversity needs to be not only respected, but should be celebrated. Mm-hmm. The problem is that, of course, within that diversity that you want to be inclusive of, there are voices and trends within that doesn't accept dissent and accept diversity in itself. And that becomes a challenge. How do you accept someone or a view that doesn't accept your view to even be expressed?
Yes, it is the challenge.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Now there is another question here that we talk about Sheikh Uthman Danfodio. He started actually with the preaching jihad, as you said, as when you define jihad. And he is suggesting that Danfodio started with the preaching jihad. He didn't just start going out with all swords blazing. So what led him to the path of fiscal jihad itself? Is it somebody deceived him? Was it his brother? Somebody suggested here. Or how did Danfodio get to that on that road of jihad?
Well, Danfodio started to challenge the Hausa rulers of northern Nigeria. He was concerned about corruption in Islam, that Muslims were being enslaved too, and that rulers were using the Quran, and this is his own word, as a lucky charm. That Islam was not reflected in practice, that these kings were actually hypocrites. And he started with jihad of the tongue, actually, and jihad of the pen. But the mistake that the Habib king made, which the West is making today, is that they felt that the response to his challenge was violence. They forbid him from preaching first, and then they banned him, and then second they tried to kill him, and he escaped. And being a Sufi himself, he was seeing in his own life a replay of the Prophet Muhammad's life. Muhammad started his jihad of the tongue in Medina from 610 to 622, 12 years, was threatened to be killed, was persecuted, and he escaped to Medina, and that God gave him the right to fight. So Danfodio saw the prophetic model in unfolding his own life. And he felt that the natural progression of his mission was to follow the prophetic path. And then we had a dream where he saw the prophet and the caliph and the founder of the Qadiriyya, that in the dream gave him a sword and asked him to use it against the enemy of God. Then that was his calling. So that's really what took him to wage jihad of the sword, although it's very much contrary to his own belief and his own philosophy as a Sufi.
Yeah, and thank you again. There's so much to learn from that. Not just the tactics and the teachings of the jihadists in the past, but the responses to those tactics and those teachings that came from the state, if you like. And what are the lessons there, even for responses today to militant Islam, or to militant or extremism that you find in different parts of the world? Because when you make them martyrs, as you rightly said, that's you just kind of exonerate them and give them even all kinds of avenues and opportunities to find ways of justifying. And he was a Sufi, as you rightly said. And so dreams and visions come readily. And so it all had a profound impact on him. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, the other question someone has posed here also is, you've talked about the timeless and sacred divine revelation and the human-produced religious knowledge, which is context-specific. But it clearly seems that people do not always fall back to the timeless divine revelation. They stop at the human-produced religious knowledge. And this person is asking, what accounts for this? That people stop short at the khutbah, at the sermon, at the commentary, rather than going into the real source. Can we all go to the original, profound, timeless, and sacred divine revelation? Can we all go there as our first source?
I hope we can, John, but I'm a historian. I study human beings. And in all societies, we have what we call an avant-garde.
Yes.
We have what we call organic intellectuals. Yes. We have those whose mission, role, profession in society is to study things and to provide guidance to others. Yeah. We are now unfortunate when those that we believe should be providing guidance to people mislead people for their own sake. Yeah. But if people are true to their religion, and I can probably say that this is true of all monotheistic religion, at least that I know better, God invests all of us with individual responsibility. All of us. That it's you can have a pastor, you can have an imam, but it's your own responsibility to learn and to build a relationship with God through the text. I refer to the concept of Khalifatullah fil ard, which means the vice regent of God on earth. And all human beings are invested with that mission because all human beings are endowed with knowledge and reason, and only human beings have that. And there's a consequence for that. God did not give you reason and the ability of critical and discursive thinking just for you to sit there and to follow as sheep. It's your responsibility to think critically. It may not be your calling to be an alim or a hufa, hafiz al-Quran and all of that. It may not be your calling to go to a seminary, but it's your calling to think critically about whatever people say to you about your religion. And when you're disturbed and uncomfortable, to go to study, to learn, or to make your own mind. Because as Islam says, at the day of judgment, you will be facing God face to face. There will be no intermediaries, and you cannot have an excuse because God will make your reason speak. You're not going to speak with your mouth and tongue as Islam thinks. Islam says you're not going to use your tongue to speak. If it's your hand that made the sin, the hand will say, hey, I stole. You know, if it's your tongue that insulted somebody and hurt somebody, your tongue is said, hey, that day I said this and that. So then you're not going to have an intermediary to vouch for you. Then you better think critically and you better take your responsibility to learn when you need to learn to provide guidance for yourself. Don't outsource your destiny to others.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't outsource your destiny to others. If you were in Accra, I would invite you to preach a sermon in my church on Sunday on this topic. This is so neat, so important. Please, if you have got a question that you want to raise your hand and then post your question, you can do that. I'll be very happy to call you if you raise up your hand and post a question. I don't see any hand here. I see a number of faithful participants on this series that we started it, and thank you all for being here. Sheikh Babu, this was a very Yakubu Habila, you almost missed the train. Please unmute and ask your question.
Good afternoon and salam. I have a mosque last Friday. I am the chairman of the mosque. So the chief of the town decided to pay us a visit. So when they were coming, I received them and then I offered them a seat in front of the mosque to sit, so that after the Jummah prayer, then the imam will come out and pray for the chief, and then they will depart. But then one of the elders of the mosque said, no, we should allow the chief to come into the mosque. So in Accra society, chiefs do not remove their sandals. So the chief entered the mosque with his sandals, and that led to a whole lot of issues. One session of the mosque, they were so annoyed. So I'm asking, must Islam be tolerant to that level of allowing Muslims to enter the mosque with their sandals? I don't think we have to be, our tolerance should go to that level of allowing people to enter the mosque with their sandals.
Thank you.
Thank you,
that
is my question, Prof.
Thank you, Habila. The lecture is about the Pacifist tradition. But Habila has a very important question because it happened in his mosque yesterday. So, Prof, if you want to respond to that, they invited this chief came for prayers, They made the chief to sit outside of the mosque, but one of the members of the mosque insisted that don't let the chief sit outside, let the chief come into the mosque. And also in the traditional sense, the chief cannot remove their sandals. The chief does not walk barefooted. So the chief had to go inside the mosque with his sandals on. We created another problem. So he's looking for a solution. What should he do?
Well, I am not an imam or an ulama, but certainly I can give my insight from my own experience and from what I know about Islamic ethics. Well, clearly Islam doesn't distinguish between chief and subject.
Yeah.
There is verses of the Quran that say the best among you are those who fear God the most. That God doesn't distinguish between woman and man, black and white, chief or subject. The best among you are those who fear God the most. In the akramu and the la atqakum. And it says in the mosque you are all the same. There is no difference. You stand shoulder to shoulder, you all remove your shoes, you all remove your headgear. Sometimes others say you don't need to remove the headgear, but you need to dress humbly because you are facing your Lord. And you don't do anything that could distract people from that connection they try to build with their God. So then certainly it will be troublesome to have a chief who doesn't want to remove his sandals, or who's coming in the mosque may disturb the peace and the concentration that people need to pray. My advice would be, if the chief doesn't want to remove his sandal and to behave humbly as any Muslim, then he might be preferable for him to pray in his own palace.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheikh. The issue is that the chief is not even a Muslim. The chief just came to visit. He's not even a Muslim. So he wasn't there to say his salat. So, but
well, it's not forbidden from a non-Muslim to enter a mosque.
Yeah.
Because a mosque is not sanctified. You don't sanctify a mosque. Yeah. There is no violation for non-Muslim entering. We have an evidence of the Caliph Umar, who is the second Caliph after the Prophet, pray in the church in Damascus.
Yeah.
We know that. We know also that I think some say he prayed in the Church of Holy Scripture in Jerusalem too. Mm-hmm. So there is no, and I know that among the Murid perspective, for example, I know that Murid actually in New York City and across the United States held some of their event in church ground. Wow. So there is no conflict having a non-Muslim, especially a people of the book, a person of the book. Yeah. I don't know about people who are not monotheistic, but certainly for Jews and Zoroastrian and Christian, they can be in a mosque. It's not a problem. But wearing those sandals and being treated differently is problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. The problem is they're being treated differently. Thank you. So, any other question that somebody wants to raise? I see our dear friend Larry. Larry, thank you for coming. Nicole, faithful servant. Khalifa Sane is here. Khalifa, thank you. Thank you for joining. Hey, Peter, thank you. Thank you. Good to see you. Comment ça passe à Paris?
Ça va bien.
Ça va bien, ça va bien. As a researcher, I do come across words such as radical Islam, jihadi Islam, and Islamists, largely in reference to extremist and terrorist groups. But listening to you, it seems jihad is a problem of Muslims and not Islam. Can you comment briefly, Prof?
Yes, I would certainly agree with your statement about jihad being a problem for Muslims. I mean, extremism of all types are a problem for people. Once again, I return to the concept of human produced religious knowledge. It's really a problem for people, not for the texts themselves. Because as they used to say, texts don't kill anybody. I say, people, have you ever seen the Quran chasing somebody? to try to stop him or something. My student laugh and I say that. I say, the Quran doesn't chase anybody to try to stop him or to do something to that person. People read the Quran and then believe that what they learn allows them to do these kind of things. Others read the Quran and believe that what they learn teach them to go away from people, to isolate somewhere and to try to survive, because mingling with people is a problem. So it's really a problem with people, it's not the problem with the text itself. As for the names and labels, in my work, I prefer really to call people the name they call themselves. I know that there are people who call themselves Salafi.
Yeah.
I try to call them Salafi. I meet people who call themselves Sufi. I try to call them Sufi. People who call themselves Shia, I call them Shia. But in my study also, I deal with concept. And I communicate beyond the level of everyday conversation. I communicate also with scholars. And I need to speak the language that those scholars actually understand. So sometimes scholars will use those isms as ideology. When they say Islamism, it's a kind of politicizing Islam, looking at Islam as ideology to build a state and so forth. In that context, of course, I can call it Islamism. There are people who are called Salafi Jihadi because in their name, they use jihad. Most of the time, they call themselves, the people of jihad or the people of hijrah. When people say that, then it's legitimate to call that people jihadist because they call themselves jihad, people of jihad and something. So that's the way really I try to struggle with all these labels. I try to understand how people call themselves, and I try to call them the way they call themselves. And when I write an academic text, I know that I'm in conversation with a community of academics. I try to see what kind of concept they use. Is I'm comfortable with those, I use it. If I'm not comfortable, I make it very clear in my text that this is the way people use this concept, but this is the way I understand it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, very important to address people the way they identify themselves so that they can recognize themselves in what you are saying about them. That is so important. Thank you. Any other question from anybody? Sheikh, as I was telling you, we had the honor of hosting the Emir, the 14th Emir of Kano yesterday at the Sane Institute. One of the comments he made was that if you look at all the militancy going about, he said, you cannot find a Tijaniya member involved in militancy. Well, I thought it was a sweeping statement, but he was making a very important point that the Tijaniya, Sufi, Suwerian, Muridiya traditions of Islam are very different from these other militant forms of Islam. And people who subscribe to these views, I've also heard others say that the Salafis are not jihadis, and they don't engage in jihad. And that you don't find those who have studied in Saudi Arabia or in other Gulf countries, you don't find them actually going out to wage jihad. But there are also the arguments that those who end up waging these militant forms of violence are products from these schools of thought. So even though the teachers may not engage in the violence themselves, they are teaching students who end up in that kind of trajectory. So is it, in this case, is it still the students to blame, the people to blame, or there is some responsibility responsibility also on the sources, on the teaching, on the texts, on the traditions themselves?
Well, we understand that El Hajj Omar Tal was a Tijani. Yeah. Certainly. We know that in the past, Tijani as well as Qadiriya and other Sufi orders have engaged in jihad, but in a very different context than the context of the 20th and the 21st century. I would say that in the context of the late 20th and the early 20th century, Sufi, in a large extent, to a large extent, have been victim of jihadis, rather than perpetrators of jihad. We can see in the case of Pakistan, as well as in the case of Egypt, and as well as in the case of northern Nigeria, that these Sufis are taking most of the violence, coming from jihadis, because they are even more scorned than the people that they believe are unbelievers, because they are seen as traitors. And this is not new. This is not new. We've seen this in the past. For example, I talk about the case of the Sufi in Algeria that refused to fight colonialism. We saw it also in the case of Al-Kademi and Usman Danfodio, when Al-Kademi refused to sanction jihad against another Muslim. So we've seen this in the past. In the present, I haven't seen evidence of Sufis engaging in jihad of the sword to any extent that could be noticeable by academics and the people that I actually study. I'm not excluding that it could be a possibility, because the circumstances in the 19th century and in the colonialism really radicalized those Sufi who believe that now this is a this is an existential situation. We need to move beyond our principle and then to fight. I don't know if this is going to happen, but it hasn't happened to any extent that I know in the 21st century. Now, what you say about the teaching and jihadi ideas and the use of violence, it's complex. It's complex. We know, of course, that those who perpetrated 9/11, many of them, 12 of them or more, are from Saudi Arabia. Although Saudi Arabia is a Salafi country, but the ideology is not Salafi jihadi. It's Salafi ilmi. It's the Salafi of knowledge, true knowledge. They believe that, they can interpret Islam in such a way that we can return to the value of the Prophet in the 7th century. But it's a form of Salafism that is interested in bringing back true Islamic knowledge, that is the Islam of the Salaf, or the Islam of the past ancestors. These are not Salafi jihadi who believe that, we need not only to bring it, but we need to force people to adopt it, and anybody who resists it himself is an unbeliever that deserves to be fought and killed, whether he's a Muslim or non-Muslim. And even when you look at the Salafi jihadi, it's complex. You have jihadis that to some extent are just nationalists in search of an ideology. You look at, for example, people that are jihadis but not global jihadis. These are, for example, Al-Shabaab, a little bit, Boko Haram in the beginning used to be like that, who use jihad as an ideology to fight a nationalist war against their own fellow Muslim or against foreigners they perceive as foreigners. But now this is the problem. The problem is this radical interpretation and very conservative interpretation of Islam have this quality of removing competing interpretation that are mostly rooted in local tradition, such as the Suwari, Ahmadu Bamba, and others that have been successful in creating an understanding of Islam that reconciles local culture with the Islamic scriptures.
Wow.
This kind of discursive tradition of Islam that Talan Asad talked about, this kind of discursive tradition of Islam that allow Muslims to interpret the sacred scriptures in a way that is commensurate to their own culture and to their own practice and to their own context. Now, when you believe this very conservative understanding of Islam, very radical and text-based understanding of Islam, what it does is to demonize any other tradition, any other human-produced understanding that contradicts the view of Islam. Now, once you wipe that out, you create a vacuum, and then anything can grow into that vacuum.
Wow. Thank you.
And most of the time, this very radical, conservative, intolerant tradition tend to take a place because they have a megaphone that the others don't have. They can have connection to international network that bring resources. they can also have the attention of the West and the publicity. And when that happens, young men, particularly immigrants, that come to the cities and are out of control because the elders are no longer there, then they tend to be, to some extent, attracted to these very extremist ideas. And also, many of the local conflicts that are there and has nothing to do with Islam. And I'm talking about particularly the conflict between farmers and herders, ethnic tension, all regionalism, ethnic strife. All those problems tend to take a color of radical Islam. And that's where we have a problem. When you remove those traditions that are locally produced, more tolerant, more open, more cosmopolitan, then you make way for more violent, extremist, but prestigious, because they are linked to Arabia, they are linked to the heart of Islam, and they very much attract young people that are always in search of extremism and adventure.
Thank you. That is something I've never had before. That is so helpful, because this idea of exclusionary discourse that does not allow room for other perspectives, for other interpretations, for other viewpoints that may even be conflictual, is just as problematic. And that is not something I have heard being said the way you just said it. So thank you so much. Thank you. Now, Peter in Paris is asking this question from the context of France. What do you, maybe you want to say, make a comment on the interaction between pacifist-oriented Muslims and the explicitly secular context? Peter did not add, but sometimes it's not just explicitly, it is aggressively secular context.
Yes, France, the problem is France is, I think Olivier Roy is, in my view, the best, he's a political scientist, he's a French scholar, I think has done the most, in my view, enlightening and understanding of the problem with the problem of Islam in France. France has a religion, a national religion that is called secularism, which is a very jealous religion. And we know its root in the French Revolution. We know that it has its own scripture, that the French Constitution. And we know that it has a very powerful creed, it's the French state. So the problem then with France is the difficulty of accepting the presence in the public sphere of any kind of culture that might breed what French call communitarism, that became a foundation for a community that beyond the Constitution and beyond what is construed as French values has its own ethic and its own moral foundation. France has a problem with that. And it's not new. We know that Judaism went through the same process. Christianism went through the same process, again, until they accept the Concordat. The idea that, okay, we accept our place now in the nation. Okay? I think in the debate during the Dreyfus affair and around there, in the parliament, the idea was Jews in France will benefit from all the rights of a French citizen, but they will benefit of no rights as an independent community. When you accept to be part of the Republic, you will benefit from all the rights of a citizen. But if you are vying for communitarism, then you will be benefit from no right as a separate community from the citizenry. Now, the problem with Islam is Islam would like to be present in the public sphere, because Islam is not only orthodoxy, it is also orthopraxis, meaning you've got to believe, but you got to practice in a way that reflects God's will in your everyday life. Now, France cannot accept that idea, which today in the 21st century is called separatism. there is a way of dressing. If you dress in a certain way, then you're offending the Republic because you're infringing on people's freedom. It's a problem. People can wear whatever they wear and maybe half naked and walk in the street. It's not a problem because it's not tied to religion. But when you wear a hijab, then it's a problem because it's dictated by Islam. Meaning Islam is governing your behavior in the public sphere. It's offensive to the Republic. Only the Republic should govern the way people behave in the public sphere. So that the issue is not only about secularism. I think, as I explained, really well from the 10th century, the idea of secularism were there. I think Ira Lapidus is very right in saying that, well, you know, already from the 8th century, you no longer have a unified caliphate in Islam. What you have are, you know, Muslim kings and emperor, and you have many of them fighting each other actually. And they're ruling, maybe they will say in the name of a caliph, but it's an imagined caliph who control nothing. You know, people will say they will say the sermon in the name of the caliph, but the caliph has no power over the Mughal of India. They have no power on the Shia of Egypt. They have no power over the Umayyad or the Umayyad of Spain. They don't control them. So the argument that you already had a fractured Islamic dominion is a reality. So the problem then is not really secularism. The problem here is Islamic orthopraxis. Are Muslims going to accept the idea that we're going to eat this way, we're going to dress this way, we're going to pray this way because that's what the Republic wants? That's the problem. That's the problem. And I mean eating this way because people now in France are fighting against halal food. Even in schools, you eat pork. If we cook pork, we don't care because it's the Republic. Now you can imagine that problem. You don't have it actually in the United States. You don't have it in many countries. I think in England, of course, you don't have it. It's a problem of France. And I think Olivier asked the right question. The question is France ready to litigate its own Republican history and culture? Are we ready to examine that core idea of French republicanism in the 21st century, where France is no longer a monolithic country of white people that like wine and cheese, but it's a multicultural country, whether you accept it or not, a multiracial country. You know, I wrote a book on African Muslim Senegalese migration, and I have 2 chapters in France and 2 chapters in the United States. And one of the things really you see in France, which you don't see in the United States, is this idea that there is an ideal type of the French, and that French doesn't know about race. France doesn't know about race. The Republic only sees citizens. Even the word race was removed from the French Constitution. It's no longer there because France doesn't have race. France only has the state and citizens. I think the problem is, can you, in the 21st century, in the context of a France where you have 8 million Muslims and people of different races, can you continue to imagine France as the France of the 19th century and the early 20th century? Is it really realistic of France to think that there is no race in France and there cannot be multiculturalism in France, that any attempt to affirm one's race and one's belief and one's culture is a threat to the nation? That it's separatism, and that's how it is called officially now. It's separatism. I think that's where the problem is. Sorry for being a little long in my response, but this is something that I really think about a lot. And since I traveled to France and I have done work in France myself, I think it's a dilemma. And France just cannot accept the idea that it's like any nation now. In the 21st century, where people are coming and going, where we have multiracialism and we have all of these things, France needs to rethink that compact. That, in my view, it does not actually work well in the time we live in.
Yeah, Thank you, Professor. That's very helpful. And from the perspective of the right wing in France, the distinctions that you've made between moderate pacifists oriented Islam and other kinds of Islam, they're invisible. Yeah, very, very helpful the way you've answered that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Babu, Sheikh. And it's been just refreshing. You've really brought our series to a very climactic end. This is a topic that we at the Sani Institute are gearing ourselves up to take on, and we are really going to enlist religious scholars across the sub-region to engage in these kinds of conversations on the Sowarian tradition, on the Murid tradition, the Tijaniya, these traditions of Islam that are so deeply rooted in Islamic sources, but also deeply rooted in African traditions and culture, in our indigenous context. And that is something that we really want to explore. And I'm so delighted that this was the topic that we chose to end the series. And thank you, friends, for making time to join us today. All of you who have been very faithful throughout the series. And like Prof. Babu said, if this was a more sexier topic, so to speak, we would have had more people join it. But it is the pacifist tradition. It is not a threat. So people are not very threatened by it. And we have this lecture recorded. It's going to be on our website. And we will be grateful if we can pass the word on. We haven't yet made up our minds completely about continuing with the series next year because of the project that we're trying to launch. But we are definitely open to it, and we are looking into it, and we will be in touch with all of you at the right time. Thank you once again, and let's all give a big shout to Prof. Babu. And Prof, you will be hearing from me too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for
all the best. Yeah.
Coming and staying and asking these wonderful questions. That really challenge me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shukran. Shukran.
Shukran jazilan. Thank you. Merci encore une fois.
Merci. Merci.